A toxic person walks into a room. They scan it the way a pickpocket scans a crowd, not looking for the most confused person, not even the most distracted one. They are looking for something very specific. The quiet one, the one sitting alone, the one who doesn't have a loud friend group around them, the one who seems from the outside like they have no one. No armor, no reinforcements, no one who would notice if something was taken from them. And so the toxic person smiles. They move in. They think this one will be easy. That is the last mistake they will make with this person, because they just picked the one person in the room. They just walked up to someone who has already been through the fire, who has already survived the rejection, the loneliness, the social exile, and came out the other side not broken, but forged. Someone who chose solitude not because the world didn't want them, but because they stopped wanting what the world was offering. The toxic person just picked the matured loner, and they have absolutely no idea what they just walked into. Here is the brutal irony. Every single quality that makes the matured loner strong reads on the surface as weakness. They don't talk much. To the toxic person, that reads as no confidence. They don't seek attention or push themselves into the center of things. That reads as insecure, desperate for notice. They sit alone comfortably. That reads as lonely, abandoned, nobody wants them. And this is where the toxic person's own psychology becomes their blind spot. Because the toxic person, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, is themselves almost always operating from a deep, gnawing insecurity. Their entire game runs on other people's need to be needed. They project. They look at the quiet person and they think, I know what that is. That's what I look like when I'm alone and desperate and pretending I'm fine. They assume the stillness is suppressed pain. They assume the solitude is a wound. They see their own shadow in someone else, and they think they know how to use it. But the matured loner isn't suppressing anything. They are simply settled. There is a difference between silence from fear and silence from satisfaction. There is a difference between sitting alone because no one chose you, and sitting alone because you chose this. The toxic person cannot tell them apart. They never learn to, because they've never experienced the second one. So they approach. They begin their moves. They start laying the groundwork, the slow warmth, the subtle flattery, the testing of emotional waters. And they wait for the reaction that tells them, yes, this one is reachable. The reaction doesn't come, not because the matured loner is playing hard to get, not because they're performing indifference, but because they genuinely, yes, at a bone level, are not moved. This is the part nobody talks about, not loudly anyway. When the toxic person's opening moves land on nothing, there's a moment, a very brief, very revealing moment where they panic. Not visibly. They're too experienced to show it openly. But internally, the script they always run, the sequence that always works, has just hit a wall. And something strange happens to a manipulator when their tactics stop working. They double down. They try harder. They get warmer. Maybe they lean into vulnerability. I don't usually open up like this, but with you it feels different. Maybe they try exclusivity, making the loner feel like they're being let into something special. Maybe they manufacture a small crisis designed to trigger the loner's care and pull them close. All of it lands flat because the matured loner has seen this before. Not necessarily this exact person but this pattern, this architecture, the unnecessary flattery that comes a little too fast, the vulnerability that feels performed, the intensity that arrived before there was any real foundation for it. Carl Jung talked about the shadow, the unconscious parts of a person they refuse to acknowledge in themselves, the insecurity behind arrogance, the hunger for control wrapped in generosity, the rage disguised as disappointment. Most people never see the shadow in others because they're too busy managing their own performance, too absorbed in the social game to step back and observe. The matured loner spent years in solitude, watching, thinking, processing. They learn to read the gap between what a person says and what a person does. They notice when someone's kindness has a condition buried in it. They notice when someone's friendliness is actually sizing them up. They notice the micro-expressions, the slight tightening around the eyes when control is slipping, the too smooth recovery when someone is caught in a lie. They don't get surprised. They just get quiet. and start watching more carefully. The toxic person is talking. The matured loner is filing information. The architecture of leverage, and why it has no foundation here. Every single toxic dynamic in the history of human relationships is built on the same thing. Leverage. Find what someone needs. Find what they're afraid to lose. Find the emotional wound they haven't dealt with yet, and press on it. Carefully, consistently, until behavior changes. It works devastatingly well on most people. On the person who needs approval, make your approval conditional. On the person who fears abandonment, go cold without warning. On the person who needs peace at any cost, create chaos until they compromise. On the person whose self-worth lives in how others see them, threaten their reputation. Every single one of these requires a hook, a place to grab, a dependency, something the person has handed over, consciously or not, that can now be used against them. Try running that playbook on someone who spent years alone, who built an internal life so complete they don't need external validation to feel like they matter. Try threatening abandonment on someone who chose to be alone and found it good. Try withholding approval from someone who genuinely stopped caring about yours 3 chapters of their life ago. The system collapses, not because the loner fought it, because there was nothing for it to grab onto. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about the individual who stops taking their values from the herd, who builds their own code from the inside out instead of living off borrowed definitions of worth. It sounds philosophical and distant, but the practical result is simple. You cannot socially punish someone who didn't outsource their self-worth to society in the first place. The matured loner doesn't ask, "Will this make people like me?" They ask, "Is this true to who I actually am?" That question, that single shift in orientation, makes every approval-based manipulation tactic structurally useless, and the toxic person reaching around for a lever to pull finds nothing but air. There is a dynamic that almost nobody explains correctly. Toxic people need reactions the way a fire needs oxygen. The explosion, the tears, the desperate explanation, the angry defense, all of it feeds the same thing. It says, "You got to me. I am still inside your head. I still matter to you enough to disturb you." The reaction is the whole point. The argument they picked, just a mechanism. The accusation they made, just a delivery device. What they wanted was never the resolution. They wanted the confirmation that they still had access, that they were still relevant inside your nervous system. So what happens when someone reads the message and simply puts the phone down? What happens when someone is accused of something and doesn't explain, doesn't defend, doesn't recount the timeline of events? Not because they're above it, not as a performance of dominance, but because they genuinely evaluated whether this person deserved that energy, and the answer was no. The person who needed the reaction starts to unravel. This is not a theory. Watch it happen in real life. The person who gets no reaction starts sending more messages, more pointed ones. They escalate. They try a different tactic. Warmth if cold didn't work, cold if warmth didn't work. They may loop around to fake apology, just to see if that reopens the channel. They become the anxious one. The power dynamic inverted without a single word being said. The matured loner doesn't do this consciously as a power move. They do it because they genuinely don't have the same relationship with silence that anxious, approval-seeking people have. Silence is comfortable, silence is home. They spent years in it. They know what it sounds like when it's peaceful, and they know when something inside them is asking for a response. And they've learned to only answer the second one when the person on the other end is actually worth it. To the toxic person, that kind of stillness feels like standing in front of a locked door and realizing you've been knocking for 10 minutes and no one is coming. There's a particular trap that catches intelligent, honest people more often than anyone else. It's called reality distortion, and it works best on people who care about the truth. The gaslighting, the blame shifting, the quiet rewriting of what happened 3 days ago. "That's not what I said." "You're being dramatic." "You always twist things." "I never did that." Delivered with total calm, with a slight tilt of the head that says, "Why are you like this?" And the honest person, the one who genuinely values truth, who keeps accurate records in their mind because integrity matters to them, tries to correct it. They bring receipts. They reconstruct the timeline. They explain carefully and clearly what was actually said. They believe with almost heartbreaking sincerity that if they can just get the facts out clearly enough, the other person will have to acknowledge them. What they don't understand is that the other person already knows the truth. They just aren't in this conversation to find it. Arguing with distortion doesn't produce truth. It produces exhaustion, and exhaustion is compliance with a time delay. The matured loner learned this, usually through painful experience, and stopped doing it, not out of resignation. Not because they gave up on truth, but because they understood something deeper. You cannot have a real argument with someone who is not engaging in reality in good faith. You can only get pulled further into the distortion. So they observe. They register what is happening for what it is. Not confusion, not miscommunication, but a tactic. And then they disengage, cleanly, without drama, without the closing speech that would give the other person one last reaction to feed on. To the toxic person, this is profoundly disorienting, because they built this entire interaction to end with the other person scrambling to defend their own reality. And instead they're just watching them leave. In every dynamic between two people, peel everything back. And there's one question underneath all of it. Who needs who more? That's it. That is the entire power structure of any relationship, condensed to its bones. Toxic people are brilliant at creating artificial need. They manufacture emotional debt. They make themselves seem essential. Through intensity, through creating problems only they can solve, through becoming the source of both the wound and the comfort, they get someone to need them. And then the control is automatic. But every single piece of it, requires a person who will stay. The matured loner doesn't stay out of fear. They don't stay because they can't imagine life without this person. They don't stay because they need the connection so badly that they'd rather have a painful one than none at all. They stay only when they want to. And when that changes, they leave. Not with a scene, not with a manifesto, not waiting around for the other person to understand or agree or give them permission. They leave the way they entered most things, quietly and completely. And once a matured loner is gone, they are actually gone. There is no lever left, no cord left to pull. The hand reaches into the space where control used to live and finds absolute silence. This is the thing the toxic person cannot process. They are used to people who come back, who can't stay away, who say they're done and then 3 days later crack. Because most people need resolution. Most people need the narrative to close properly. Most people can't sit with the discomfort of a relationship that ended without a clean explanation. The matured loner doesn't need that. They made peace with open endings a long time ago. They know not everything resolves. They know some people don't deserve a closing conversation. They know that sometimes the walk out the door is the answer. And that finality, that quiet, complete, unretractable exit, is the most psychologically devastating thing they could do. Not because it was designed to be, just because it's real. Here is something that needs to be said slowly. Toxic people don't actually need to win arguments. They don't need your agreement. They don't even need your submission, technically. What they need, what they cannot function without, is to remain relevant inside your mind. When someone is lying awake at 2 a.m. turning over a conversation that happened 4 days ago, the toxic person wins. When someone changes how they speak, how they dress, how they move through a room, based on what they think a toxic person might say, the toxic person wins. When someone rehearses the perfect response to something that hasn't even happened yet, the toxic person has already won before the conversation starts. The real currency in every toxic dynamic is not money. It's not respect. It's not even emotional control exactly. It's attention, the space inside your head, the hours of your mental life, the portion of your nervous system that is quietly dedicated to managing, predicting, and reacting to one other person. The matured loner is ruthlessly, almost clinically selective about who gets that space, not out of coldness, not because they don't feel things, but because years of solitude taught them what it feels like when their mental space is theirs, uncluttered, peaceful, productive, and what it feels like when someone has colonized it. And they will not go back to the second one, not for charm, not for intensity, not for anything. The loop that keeps toxic dynamics alive, the obsessive mental replaying, the endless hope that maybe this time will be different, that loop never even starts. Because the matured loner never handed over the remote control in the first place. Or if they did once a long time ago, they took it back. And they remembered what it cost them to give it away. Everyone wants to believe strength looks like fighting back, standing up in front of everyone, delivering the perfect takedown, winning the argument so thoroughly that the other person has no choice but to fold publicly, in front of witnesses. That's the story we like. It's clean, it's satisfying, it closes properly. The real thing is quieter and harder to recognize and far more complete. Anything that can provoke you, can control you. That's not a clever saying. That's an engineering principle. If pushing a button produces a consistent output, the button can be used. If screaming at a machine makes it break, the machine can be broken. The matured loner understood this, not from a book, from repetition, from getting provoked enough times to finally see the mechanism for what it was, from realizing that the moment they reacted, the moment they raised their voice or cried, the power transferred. So they stopped. They stopped over-explaining themselves to people who had already decided what to think. They stopped chasing closure from people who were counting on that chase to maintain control. They stopped attending every fight they were invited to. They stopped giving access to people who had shown clearly, repeatedly, that access would be used as a weapon. They didn't become better at the game. They became irrelevant to it. Not as a tactic, not as a strategy. As a consequence of everything they went, through everything they chose, everything they built inside themselves when the world was quiet, and no one was watching, and the only person who needed to believe in them was them. And that quiet, earned, battle-tested self-possession is why the toxic person picked the wrong one. They walked up to silence thinking it was emptiness. It was depth. And by the time they realized the difference, the matured loner had already stopped paying attention. If this description felt personal, it was written for you. Not for the version of you performing fine, for the version that went through the fire and is still standing. Drop a comment. Tell us which part hit. Tell us what you've been through. I read every single one, more than you'd expect. See you in the next one. Till then, take care of yourself, my friends.